The United States, the land of the free and the home of the brave, the oldest democracy of the world, a country whose president is dubbed the leader of the free world. Since World War II, this nation has taken it upon itself to become the democratic enforcer around the globe. It has taken military action to overthrow dictators and given sermons on human rights around the world. However, America's military adventures, while sold to the world as missions to spread democracy, have only been strategic and economic interests driven. Military tactics to expand its influence and reach around the globe, no matter the human cost. The Center for Democracy, Pluralism and Human Rights has made that case in a detailed report exposing the black record of the so-called champion of democracy. While the nation preaches human rights to the globe, its military has committed numerous atrocities in these war zones and have failed, in fact, allied themselves with brutal dictatorships and warlords. Look at Afghanistan, which the United States invaded in the year 2001. The military machine of the West murdered over 240,000 people. 3.5 million Afghans were internally displaced and 2.2 million refugees were created. The pullout of the United States was so botched, it took the Taliban just a few weeks to regain power. The thousands killed and billions spent on waging that war amounted to nothing. If we look at the Iraq, which the United States sold to the world as a war for freedom to depose Saddam Hussein, claiming that the Iraq regime had weapons of mass destruction. All of that was a lie. Thousands were killed in that conflict and 9.2 million people were displaced. Not only did the United States reduce the nation to rubble and violate the Geneva Convention, Saddam was once their asset who they supplied with chemical weapons to target the Kurds. Yet, America tells the world that policy should be driven by compassion and goodwill. Not just its foreign policy, ladies and gentlemen, the country which boasts the same diversity as India is guilty of gross human rights violations against its own people. I am not talking about incidents of communal violence. I am talking about state-sanctioned actions against minorities in the United States, who just a few decades back were victims of segregation, targeted killings, and the denial of the right to vote and education. Even today, the police machinery is unleashed against them and the families and communities of victims are not given justice because the system is still divided along racial lines. They tell us they are concerned about human rights violations in India, but they have no moral right to be the so-called gatekeepers of justice, both abroad and even at home. This is the reality of the human rights champion of the globe. George Floyd in broad daylight, pinned, choked and murdered by a cop. The man is calling out for help, but the cop did not flinch. George Floyd was the spark for Black Lives Matter movement, representing police killings of other African Americans, including Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake and Trayvon Martin. Not just that, as per the report, many states have provisions to bar African Americans from voting by limiting election facilities in black neighborhoods. There are strict gun control laws in areas with a higher black population. There is low African American recruitment in the judiciary. There is a huge backlash to the reform to expand the history books to include the contribution of African Americans like Malcolm X under the bogey of critical race theory. African Americans have poor representation in media and academia. Many states have cases of targeted abortions of African Americans. They face racism in political parties across the country, and even decades after civil rights movement, they face tough voter ID laws in many American states. If you look at the Native Americans, the original inhabitants of the continent, they have been denied the right to govern their lands since 1831. They live in poorly facilitated reservations where their income is 68% below the national average and 20% households earn less than $5,000 a year. The lack of social mobility has led to an explosion of crime in their areas, with rape crimes 2.5% higher than the national average and child abuse 100% higher than the national average. Not just the native population, but immigrants, those who make unsung contributions to the American economy, are subject to grave injustices with targeted attacks against Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus by white nationalist groups who are often given cover fire by the Republican right. The report draws a stark contrast to how Hinduism has also become a target of state-sanctioned racism. While biblical miracles are treated as history, there is a brazen sidelining of Hindu texts. Zoning laws in the United States restrict Hindu and Buddhist places of worship. In centers of education, they are often ridiculed and treated with hostility, allowing the narratives of Christian fundamentalism to direct policy. The Declaration of Independence, one of the most hallowed documents of American history, says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but the nation is guilty of using human rights not as a philosophy, but as a strategic tool."